Sometime in the mid-1400s, Rabbi Shlomo Duran of Algiers penned a remarkable teshuvah directed at a group of conversos in Spain. These individuals, who had been forced to outwardly embrace Christianity since the 1391 persecutions, had managed to maintain their Jewish faith in secret. Their question centered on how they could refrain from the worst forms of chametz on Pesach without drawing the suspicion of the authorities, an endeavor fraught with challenges. This teshuvah touches on many of the halachic elements of chametz and reveals the historical struggles of the Marranos in mid-15th-century Spain. Our story tonight is going to be something that occurs in the 15th century, probably sometime between the 1440s and the 1460s. The rabbi who we're going to be studying tonight, his name is Rabbi Shlomo Duran. Rabbi Shlomo Duran lived in Algiers, which is North Africa. It's on the coast of North Africa, so right across the sea is Spain, and that's going to be an important part of our story. Reb Shlomo's father was known as Reb Shimon ben Samach Duran. He's a very famous Rishon, Reb Shimon ben Samach Duran. And so Reb Shlomo, his son, gets the acronym Rashbash, Reb Shlomo ben Shimon. And he has a volume of teshuvahs that is known as Shalos Teshuvahs HaRashbash. And our story is going to be in Siman Sadik of these teshuvahs. Just a note before we jump into this, Reb Shlomo himself was born in Algiers. However, his father was not born in Algiers. His father was a Spanish Jew, born in Spain, but was forced to leave Spain. When? In 1391. So briefly, and we've touched on this in the past, but briefly again, in the year 1391, there were mass persecutions against the Jewish people living in all areas of Spain. And as a result, many Jews were forcibly converted, and many fled. And one of those Jews who fled was Reb Shimon ben Samach, who's the father of Reb Shlomo Duran, who we're going to be talking about tonight. Reb Shimon fled to Algiers. That's where he became a Rav and a Dayan. And after he passed away in 1444, his son became the Rav and the Dayan, living there as well until 1467. We can guess, though we can't know for sure, that this teshuvah would be after his father passed away, while he was the Rav. We can never know for sure, because it's also possible that he wrote this teshuvah while his father was still the Rav, as sometimes happens, so you can't say for sure. But as a working hypothesis, it's something that we will stick with, and that's why I'm saying this story likely happened sometimes between 1444, the passing of his father, and 1467, his own passing. Let's read inside Siman Sadik. Nishalti, I was asked, Al Elu ha'anusim, about those conversos, or anusim literally means the people who were forcibly converted. Asher libam lashamayim, who they mean well, they still want to serve Hashem. V'chafetzim lekayim hamitzvahs kefi yecholtam, and they want to observe the mitzvahs according to their ability. So notice that he's talking about a certain class of anusim. He's not saying all anusim. He's talking about elu ha'anusim, a certain class of anusim. They're unique in the fact that they're loyal to Hashem and they want to do the mitzvahs kefi yecholtam. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes. Kefi yecholtam, obviously a Jew who converted to Christianity, even if it was under duress, he had to live as a Christian. He was not allowed to observe Torah and mitzvahs, and so therefore it had to be in hiding, and so therefore it's kefi yecholtam. They're trying to do to the degree that they can. So what was the question? Eich tia bepesach hanagasam. What should they do on Pesach? How should they behave b'inyan achilasam in terms of eating? Shalo yavayu lidei kares ba'achilas chametz. How can they avoid the severe penalty of kares? So is the pshat that they were afraid of the oynish? Oynish kares can have serious implications spiritually, even perhaps physically as well. depending on how we understand the prohibition of kares bisman hazeh. But so was their concern, or they're only referring to kares because it's just an indicator that we're talking about a very, very serious prohibition? Either way, so they want to know what should they do to avoid this, because someone who eats chametz on Pesach, it's chayiv kares. So what can they do to avoid this kares? Despite the fact that they're not going to be able to keep a complete Pesach. That is not happening. That's what he's saying. It's very clear that if they're going to be doing something, it's going to have to be a compromise kashal Pesach, because it's impossible that they're going to be able to keep a full Pesach. Now he goes on to describe their problem. You could come over to them and say, well, one second, what's the big deal? What's the problem? So let's think about this. To go to the local matzah bakery and to buy shmura matzah, that's upgefrekt. That's something they couldn't do, because they would be noticed buying matzah, and that's clear Jewish observance, so that's something someone would report, and they would be in trouble. So buying matzah from the local Jewish bakery was obviously off the table. Okay, so they can't do that. So you say, well, you can eat meat, you can have fruits, and you can have vegetables. That's true, but we need grain. You need to have some element of grain. And chametz we don't want to eat. So now what? What are we going to do now? So now you can say a solution. Hold on. We're not in Ashkenaz. We're not in Germany and France. We're in Spain. They're not Nizar and Kitnius. They eat rice. So let them eat rice. Says Rashbash, even if they only eat rice, it's still going to be a problem. That's not going to be sufficient as their grain. Why? They will be accused by the Christians, Lamar, who will say, you're still keeping the traditions of your ancestors, to eat rice. Everyone eats rice. The way I understand this line here is that Jews in Spain, it was well known, we eat matzah, but it was also a very long established custom, not only that you could eat rice, but that we do eat rice. And this was a very well-known thing, and there were probably fancy recipes and dishes that it was known. Oh, Pesach comes, the way what happened in America with brisket for Pesach, so like it was probably even more rice in Spain. So if we're going to eat rice, which is not officially a ritual food, we're still going to get in trouble. I think it means every Jewish house has oiris. And so therefore they're afraid. What are they supposed to do? So again, to go to regular chametz, that's isakaris, they don't want to do. And some of them, it's interesting, he stresses that it's some of them, who are pained and who are troubled and they're kvetching. Is there a way where you could be mekel the iser? What does it mean, lahakel iser? Again, some element of a regular Spanish Jewry observance of chametz, it's not going to be shaykh for them to do. They're going to have to be breaking the norm. And that's why the lashon over here is lahakel iser. They're going to have to cross lines. But the question is, are there ways, al pi halacha, that we would say it is okay to cross this line, it is okay to cross this other line, and you'll stay away from kares? That's really what the shaila is over here. Because again, if there was an avenue where you didn't need to be mekel on an iser, so then you don't need to go to the Rav. Then just do that. But really, we have no options. Chametz is not an option. Matzah is not an option. Rice is not an option. So what is the option for how these Jews could eat grain? This is the question that comes to the desk of Reb Shlomo ben Reb Shimon Duran. Now, it's interesting, he's not living in Spain, he's living in Algiers. But I think we could understand that it was probably unlikely for what we'll call a Marrano Jew, these Anusim, to go over to the Rav and to say, remember I used to ask you shilas a few years ago, so I have a shaila now about how I can, that obviously would be very dangerous. They can't do that. But let's remember like this. Many of the Jews who converted did run away. And if they ran away, where did they go? They went to Algiers. So let's say Ruvain ran away, went to Algiers. His brother Shimon is still living as a Christian in Spain. Shimon and Ruvain are still communicating with each other with letters. And that's probably how this question ends up coming to a Rav who's in Algiers, where it's basically, I could imagine that it could even be Shimon left in Spain, never even asked the Shaila. I could imagine that he never even asked the Shaila. But Reuven, his brother, who cares a lot about him and who lives in Algiers, is like, oh, I want my brother, and I think my brother, he wants to, and is there a way, but he can't. So he asks Reb Shlomo Duran on his own. He asks Reb Shlomo Duran, tell me, what could my brother do? And that's how this question becomes a Shaila. As far as I know, this is the only Shaila I ever saw that was like, how can I keep a mitzvah? What is an optimal way I can observe a mitzvah given the fact that I'm a Marrano? I'm not familiar with other, I'm not saying there aren't. I've never seen another Shaila in this vein. Of course, Anusim are mentioned tons of times in teshuvahs, but in this specific context of where one is trying to say, like, what should I do Pesach? What should I do Shabbos? What should I do B'negei Kashrus? I'm not very familiar. I haven't seen anything other than this, which makes this teshuvah really, really unique. There's another point that we need to clarify before we move forward here, and that is, this happens before the Spanish Inquisition. That is, we're all familiar with the Spanish Inquisition, and they're trying to root out heresy, and they're trying to find Jews practicing Judaism clandestinely and all of that. Yes, the Inquisition was formed in 1478. Okay, so it's long after, but it's a number of years after Reb Shlomo passed away. I said before, he passed away in 1467. It doesn't matter. The Inquisition, that was an official institution that was geared for this, but it didn't. Before the institution of the Inquisition, it was still illegal, and there was still punishments if Jews were caught doing this. So, though the Inquisition didn't exist, the reality and the shaila was still a real shaila. Okay. Now, before we go into Reb Shlomo Duran's answer, we want to focus a little bit on what I alluded to earlier. The fact that he classifies these anusim as a unique group. He doesn't say about all the anusim. He says, there's Elu ha-anusim. And then he describes what's like special about them. And then later in the teshuvah, he said, that some of them are asking this shaila. See, he seems to be kind of, especially at the end over there, going out of his way to highlight that this is not everyone, but this is only a certain demographic that is asking this question. So this really brings us into a larger topic, and that is the status of these Jews, the many Jews who unfortunately converted in 1391 because of the persecution at the time. So, good. We know the beginning of the story. We know chapter 1, what triggered the conversion. But then what happened after? What was their level of feelings for Yiddishkeit? What was the level of practice of Yiddishkeit? And how did their fellow Jews regard them? And all of that. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, and then I think this will help explain a little what Reb Shlomo Duran means over here when he limits them to a very specific subset amongst the Anusim. So we actually once discussed the following teshuvah in a previous shir. It's a teshuvah from Rabbi Yitzchak bar Sheshes. He's a generation before. He passed away in 1408, similar to Reb Shlomo's father, because he also was a Rav in Spain, specifically in Valencia. And in 1391, he fled and came to Algiers and was the Rav in this great city. And the shaila that comes to him in Siman Yud Aleph is basically a woman who is in Spain, who is described as an Isha Anusa, and she received a get from her husband, who was also Anus, a Jew. They were both born Jews, and they both went through this conversion in 1391. But then she got a get from her husband. And she came to live in North Africa, and she wants to start out her life again as a Jew. Now, obviously, she wants to remarry. The problem is, and she has a get. The problem is, who were the witnesses on the get? The witnesses on the get were another two Jews who converted. So the shaila is, are those Jews who converted, who remained in Spain, are they kosher for eidos? Do you say that they're the din of Rishoim? If they have the din of Rishoim, so then you can't count them as witnesses, in which case the get would not be valid, in which case this woman cannot remarry now in North Africa? Or do you say they don't have the din of Rishoim, and so therefore these women, they're valid witnesses, which makes the get effective, and so therefore this woman is able to remarry? What does Rabbi Yitzchak bar Sheshes respond? He responds as follows. Regarding these Anusim who went through this persecution, but they've stayed a long period of time amongst the Gentiles. So then his lashon is roi lachker harbe b'inyanam, in the second paragraph of 2. We have to investigate a lot about them. Why? And here he goes on to say that there are 2 different groups amongst these anusim. Because there are those, he says, that although it started off be'oinus, that they were forced to convert, but achar kein parku oil shamayim. Later on, they're like, you know something, this is my new life, let me just get comfortable with it. Let's move on from Yiddishkeit. And on their own, they go and they follow all the Gentile customs and they violate all the mitzvahs in the Torah. Not only that, but they also persecute their fellow Jews. And then he goes on to say, there's anusim asher libam lashamayim. There are those converts, people, conversos, who are different from them. Who libam lashamayim, they're still loyal to Hashem. So these no-goodniks, these anusim, who completely became turncoats, they give these anusim a hard time. They basically go over to the government and they say, by the way, I'm a good Christian. That other guy, that Yankel, he's actually a Yankel, and he's trying to leave. And you know why he's trying to leave the country? He's trying to leave the country because he wants to be a Jew, etc., etc., etc. And Rivash goes on to say, we heard reports about this in Valencia and Barcelona. So he names 2 Spanish cities that had this problem in particular. So obviously this bad group, he says, they're not counted as Jews. Obviously, they are disqualified for Eden. But then there's another group, and really he already alluded to it. He said, Anusim asher libam lashamayim. These are Anusim whose heart is loyal to Hashem. And he describes them now as saying, they actually want to leave. The problem is, they can't. They simply cannot afford the trip of uprooting their family and going to North Africa. And in the meanwhile, while they're still living in Spain, as crypto Jews, they are careful as much as possible. Milis goyel betumas averes. They stay away from any aver as possible. Zulasi b'shas sakanav. Makam sakanav. Of course, if their life is going to be at threat, in other words, if their cover is going to be blown, then they'll do the avera. They have no choice. They'll be mechal Shabbos, so eat non-kosher food. But to the degree that they're able, and it comes at no risk, then quietly in their home, they're still loyal to Hashem. So says the Rivash, these people are not wicked, and they are valid witnesses. So in other words, what Rivash did for us sometime between 1391 and his passing in 1408 is that he gave to us the fact that there's 2 classes of anusim. And therefore he goes on to say, so what should I do about a get? So he says something very interesting. When you have anusim who are signed on a get, you have to roi lachkar harbe binyam. You have to investigate. You have to know which class. In other words, it could be this, it could be that. He says, the very fact that everyone stayed, whoever is there now, there's already a question mark. Why did you stay? And so maybe you have a good answer that you Pashut couldn't leave. But still, there's a question mark. And as a result of that, everyone lost their cheskes kashrus and basically needed to do an investigation, case-by-case basis, to figure out what type of converso are you. If it's tzrichin, chakiras, chacham, shayachar aleim, this requires a chacham, a rav, to actually do some investigative work to figure this out. So you see clearly over here the concept of 2 populations amongst the anusim. The idea that because they were all forcibly converted, therefore all of them were secretly wanting to be Jews is not true. That definitely is not true. There were those who, they may have had doubts about Judaism before, or for whatever reason. We don't have to go into it right now, but for whatever reason, by the time 1392 came, 1395, 1400, 1402, 1403, some of them identified as Christians all the way through. Some of them not. And when he speaks about the group that is not, it's interesting, the word to use is anusim asher libam lashamayim, the Rivash does. How did Reb Shlomo Duran's teshuvah begin? Reb Shlomo Duran's teshuvah began, Nish'alti al elu ha'anusim asher libam lashamayim. I was asked about the anusim asher libam lashamayim. So they're talking about, he's talking about one of these 2 groups, and that explains why he's explaining. He doesn't just say Nish'alti al elu ha'anusim, because anusim is a word that is used for everyone. And no, so it's specifically about Hanusim Asher Liban Lashamayim, and specifically talking about this unique demographic. And as he says, V'rotzu Ksasam, some of them are asking this question. Now the truth is, we see this idea of the two populations amongst the Anusim in other teshuvahs of Reb Shlomo Duran himself. So in Siman Kuf Mem Gimel, he deals with the following interesting case. There was a woman who he calls Hamishumedes and Hamufkeres. So Mishumedes, we know what that is. Mishumedes is Shmad, and that is she converted. She converted. The question is, did she convert to Christianity in Spain? Or, because this story happened in North Africa, did she perhaps convert to Islam in North Africa? That's not entirely clear. But she converted to another religion. But it also refers to her as Hamufkeres, which means she's behaving improperly with men. And what happens is that she then donates a mappa, a decal, a cover for the Sefer Torah. And this occurs in the city Mostaganen. Okay, that's the name of the city. It's in Algeria. And what happens is, the case is pretty curious, that then Jews from a village called Mezagrain, which is very close, it's 4 kilometers away from this larger city, they took it away. They're like, hey, we like that decal for the Torah, we want it for our shul. So the question that comes to the desk of Reb Shlomo Duran is this mappa permitted, bichlal, to be used in a shul? What's the shaila? The shaila is whether this has the din of ethnan zoina, and that is the payment that is given to a zoina is forbidden to be brought as a carbon for the mizbeach. There are many dinim and details involved in that. And so the question over here is, well, if such a payment, let's say it was an animal, cannot be brought as a carbon to the Beis HaMikdash, so then similar, this woman who had this negative reputation, maybe the mappa should not be allowed to be brought into a shul. Then the question went further. And if it doesn't have the din of an esnan, maybe b'chlal you shouldn't accept it from her, for other reasons. What are the other reasons? Specifically because of her conversion. And if it is permitted to accept it, then where should it belong? Should it go to the city of Mostaganen where she donated it? Or should it go to the village of Mezagrain that seems to have taken it? Okay, so that's a very interesting case and question. So answers Reb Shlomo ben Reb Shimon, the Rashbash answers, about Ethnan, Ein Shum Beis Michush, there's nothing to worry about, there's no concern, it does not have the din of an Ethnan, and I'd rather not get into all the specifics of that right now. Suffice it to say, doesn't have the din of an Ethnan. Okay. Are you allowed to accept it to her? Afal Bisha Ein Ethnan. So then what would be the problem? Mishum to have a Goya, because she has the din of a non-Jew, and we're not supposed to be Makabel for a donation for a Sefer Torah from a non-Jew. Says he about this, Uv'inyan say about this, I already have a psak from my father. Kama pamim leheter. What does that mean? Basically, there is this concept of not accepting donations and from non-Jews. And over the years, it happened from time to time that a Jew who converted, and he feels he's still some affinity to the Jewish people, and whether he's giving money to the Jewish community for the poor or whatever, and there's a certain halachic analysis that you need to have there, because you could say that maybe you shouldn't accept that money. So he's saying that his father, Reb Shimon ben Samach Duran, in these cases was makabel. Why? Because of Eva. We need to have good relations with them, and we don't want to alienate them, and so therefore you're allowed to accept the gift. And so therefore, same thing for this woman, we're allowed to accept the gift. Remember, Eva is not a problem. Now, the fact that she's converted is not a problem. And then once we understand that, then obviously the place where she donated it, that's where it needs to go, and not to the place that ripped it off. This is the answer that he gives. But when he says this, and when he quotes his father's psak that we're allowed to take donations from this population of conversos, how does he word it? Ha'anusim oy ha'mishumadim. He uses 2 words. Anusim is people who are forced. Mishumadim is people who willingly converted. Now, it's possible that what he means here is mishumadim, someone who just randomly chose to walk up one day and say, I want to convert. And anusim is people who are forcibly converted. It is possible to say that. However, it is also possible that we're talking about the 2 populations. Because remember, we saw in the teshuvah of the Rivash before that we had two populations. We had the population of Libam La Shamayim, and we had the population of those who he called Ein Lahem Chelek Be'Elokei Yisrael. And that could also be the Anusim and the Mishumadim. And in fact, we're going to see that later on. In other words, all of them started out as Anusim, but then one retained their status as Anusim, and one became Mishumadim. We see that also in Simin Reish Chav Gimel, where Rashba says, Ha'anusim v'ha'mishumadim shabo al anusais oy ha'mishumadais dinan ki Yisrael le'inyan avladais. That children born to these types of Jews, so their identity is Jewish. And when he does it, he says it applies to both populations, whether him and her are anusim, whether him and her are mishumadim. Again, this feeling for there being two populations. However, there's other teshuvahs in where when Reb Shlomo talks about this issue, he seems to actually talk about there being only one population, where he kind of negates the idea that there's any true anusim anymore, and that they're all mishumadim. And that becomes we see in Siman Peites. Look what he says in Siman Peites. So the truth is, Shas Teshuvas Rashbash Siman Peites is not a typical teshuvah. It's not a response to a question. In fact, in another teshuvah, he refers to this as an article that he wrote. He says this is called Maimer Ha'anusim. And basically, there was an issue that was going on at the time, so Reb Shlomo sat down and wrote an essay. And he starts like this. Arma Shlomo ben Rav Reb Shimon, says Shlomo, the son of Reb Shimon, who's already passed away, ben HaChacham Reb Tzemach, and my grandfather's name was Tzemach. Bnei Elah Mishumadim, the children of the Mishumadim, Hanikraim Anusim, who people call Anusim. And these children of these Mishumadim, who people call Anusim, they're Arelim. And now these children want to come back and they want to do teshuvah. So what is the din? Do they need to go to mikveh, for example? No, they're mamash. So in other words, he's dealing with these conversos, and a next generation came, and then the kid says he wants to come in, he wants to rejoin the Jewish people. Does he need to go through a gerus? Chas v'shalom. He doesn't need to go through a gerus. I don't care how his parents lived or anything, or how he lived. He needs a bris, get him a bris. Does he need to go to mikveh? No, he doesn't need to go to mikveh. He's a yid l'chol davar. Afal pi shechata yisraelu. He brings a gemara, even though chata yisraelu, and so therefore is a yid. However, when he talks about these kids' parents, how does he define the parents? He says they're mishumadim. Hanikraim anusim. Hanikraim anusim means and we know this from elsewhere. The Jewish collective community referred to them, anusim, they're forced. That's what Jewish people wanted to believe, that they were forced, and that they didn't really want to be Christian, and that given the opportunity, they would all return. So the name anusim was used all the time. He seems to be saying over here, I'm not so sure how much of a fan I am of the word anusim. Really, they're mishumadim, because they're not really, for all the things we spoke about, they're not really loyal, they're staying there, and they don't really want to, and they're mechal Shabbos and other averes befaresia, etc., etc., etc. And so here you start seeing, rather than the language of there's two populations, we start seeing over here, it's kind of one population, or at least in his view, there's one population. And we see the same idea in the last teshuvah that we're going to see before we go back to our main topic. And that is in Simin Tov Kuf Nun Gimel, where Rashbatz does something very similar. He's dealing here with a case of wine. So wine comes, and you have these Marranos who they testify that, by the way, I have no personal stake in this wine, I just happened to be on the ship, it was handled by Jews, it's kosher, you don't have to worry about stam yenam, it's 100% kosher. So could you believe that statement? So Rashbash says, no, how could you believe his testimony to that? You can't believe him. My father said that you could believe them in cases when they don't have a conflict of interest. Says Rashbash, Zehu b'rishonim. That was earlier, in the earlier times. Where they weren't Mechal Shabbos Befaresia. In other words, they tried to keep Shabbos as much as possible. Today, Shekulam Mechal Shabbos Befaresia, where they're all desecrating Shabbos Befaresia, and he says, Kulam. Ein lamin an klal, we throw out their namanos. So here it really seems to be saying, like, I don't trust them anymore. They're not libam l'shamayim anymore. So these last two teshuvos really paint a picture that is different from the picture in Rivash. Let's go back. Rivash earlier on is saying what? There's two populations. You need a rabbi to figure out what category the guy goes into right now. And although there are some teshuvahs of Reb Shlomo ben Reb Shimon that seem to be saying this concept that there's two populations, we definitely have two very clear teshuvahs in where he kind of says it's one, it's all one, and I don't trust them, and they're all mishumadim, and they're all mechalal Shabbos befaresi, etc. So now you need to think of how do you take the teshuvah where he himself is asked about elu ha'anusim, there are some anusim, maybe they're not so many, but libam lashamayim, and he's now going to write a teshuvah for them about how to observe Pesach. So how are we supposed to understand that? In terms of this, is it like a time? Are you supposed to understand like a timeline? Like you start out with two populations, and then it becomes less and less and less and less and less until you have one population, and our teshuvah is kind of in that in-between stage. Is that what it is? I don't know that you have to say that. It could even be that even as he normally said, it's one population, but he knew that there's pockets. He knew that there's always going to be, that there's still a miut. And so this teshuvah becomes something that could even be consistent with him saying there's only one population. I don't know that we mamish have to work it all out, but I did want to take that teshuvah and put it up against the other pieces of his writing so you have a little bit of an understanding of the context of the time and how he thought about the conversos in general and these individuals asking the question in particular. Okay. And now, let's get to the main issue. And the main issue is, how is he going to answer their question? And he's very interesting teshuvah that he built. So let's look at number 7, because he quotes the following Gemara, and he says, my teshuvah is going to follow the pattern of this Gemara in Maseches Yoma. The Gemara in Yoma says, Ubra sheiricha b'sara kodesh, if you have a pregnant woman who smells a meat that's kodesh, and therefore forbidden for her to eat, Oy b'sar chazir, so it's non-kosher food. But at the same time, she's really craving it, and there's a fear that her life is at risk if she doesn't eat it. So what do we do? First you take a rod and you dip it into the sauce. And you put it in her mouth. And she tastes the sauce of this dish. Now that's an issur, you're not allowed to taste the sauce of the dish. But we gave her, now remember, we didn't give her a spoonful. Spoonful is more. Here you put a little on a stick and you put a little, hopefully that's going to be enough. Imnis yashodata, if that calmed her down, mutav, great. Vim lav, if it didn't, machila maisa roitav atzma. So now you take some of the sauce, you put it in a cup, you say, go ahead, drink it. Imnis yashodata, if that worked, mutav, then great. Vim lav, if that didn't work, machilin oisa shuman atzma. Now you give her the actual meat. Why? Because ein l'chol davar she'ein b'fnei pikuach nefesh. Nothing gets in the way of pikuach nefesh except for the big 3. This isn't one of the big 3, and so therefore this is what we do. But even when we do it, we go progressively. We don't jump right to the shtik chazer. And the Gemara gives us 3 steps. One is where you give a little roitiv. 2 is where you give a lot of roitiv. So there the difference is only in quantity. A little roitiv, a little sauce, a lot of sauce. The next step is actually a leap in terms of quality as well, not just quantity. Because when you move from sauce to the actual flesh, the actual meat, so this gets you into the concept of there's the tam and there's the ikr. Halacha says tam ke ikr. Both are forbidden. We understand that. But everyone understands that also the ikr is more serious. And so therefore here, it's not only more of a sheer, bigger quantity that you're consuming, you're actually stepping up in terms of the severity of the issur by going into the flesh on its own. Some of the Rishonim, when they talk about this Gemara, say, and when you go to the flesh, you have to follow the pattern of the Gemara. The pattern of the Gemara said, go slow. So don't give her 4 pounds, you give her a little. Give her a chati shear. Give her a small amount. If she needs more, then you're going to give her more. So this is the model that the Gemara in Yuma says. Remember, even though it's pikuach nefesh, so just give her the meat. No, we go progressively. Says Reb Shlomo, Shadin elo anusim. These conversos in Spain, who kadin ubara sheirecha, is similar to this pregnant woman who caught the smell, or a similar case is choila machmasakana, or a sick, or someone who's ill and is in danger. So we're going to follow the same principle. Shakol sheyachol lisbel v'lamav be'isr. Yeah, we're going to have to cut corners. He says we're going to have to cut corners, but we're going to try to cut the minimum possible. That's what the mandate we got from this Gemara. When you're doing something wrong, you try to minimize it as much as possible. So what happens is, he builds up in this teshuvah 1, 2, 3, 4. I think it's fair to break down the teshuvah into 4 steps. Oh, he says, I'll be matir this. And if that doesn't work, I'll be matir that. And as we're going to see, each one of these steps is step 2 is a bigger chiddush than step 1. And step 3 is more aggressive than step 2. Each one is kind of more of a bigger heter as we move along. Again, consistent with the theme that he developed here in the Gemara. It's interesting because the Gemara is talking about someone they're physically ill. They're physically ill. There's nothing they can do to control the fact that their body is ill right now. So the Torah says, oh, okay, so we're matir certain isurim for them. He's moving this now to a different zone. He's moving this to a zone where someone isn't physically ill. They're in a certain country, and they're we could tell them to leave. In this teshuvah, he does not mention anything about them leaving. But theoretically, we could say, well, you're supposed to be leaving, right? But at the end of the day, very difficult. And then their lives are at stake if they get caught observing Yiddishkeit. And so he says, we're going to treat it the same way as the din of a choila. So what's his step 1? His step 1 is going to be about creating dishes, grain-based dishes, that aren't going to be chametz. Why? Because you're going to use mei peiros. Instead of using water, you're going to use mei peiros. So let's have a read. Says Rabbi Shlomo, me'ata be'elo anusin, these conversos, im efshar lases matzah ashira, if they can make fruit juice-based matzah, kigoin, for example, sheyalo shaysa b'chalav, knead the dough with milk, but in which case, be careful, lo yachal b'basar, obviously don't eat fleishiks with it. O yalush b'shemen, or the other option, going with oil, oy bidvash, or with honey, oy biyayin, or with wine. So kol zeh nasa b'heter. All of this is permitted. Ve'ein bedavar beis michush. There is no worry here whatsoever. So in other words, this doesn't even take a lot of guts to be matir this. As he says in his lashon, ve'ein bedavar beis michush. There's no real worry over here. So what's the background? What's going on over here? And so for that, let's go to the sefer that Reb Shlomo would have been very familiar with as a key to dealing with halachic issues, especially if you're looking for a summary, and that's the Torah. So the Torah in Orach Chaim, Siman Tov Samach Beis, quotes the Gemara in Pesachim. The Gemara in Pesachim says the following words: Mei peiros ein machmitzin. That fruit juice does not cause leavening. Now that sounds like a very simple statement, but look what the Torah says. V'rabu bazeh hadeyos. There are many opinions about this. Indeed, this subject about how wine and milk and honey and apple juice or orange juice, how and to what degree it creates chametz, is such a complicated subject with so many different shittas about it, as the Torah says, v'rabu bazeh hadeyos, that it really makes it even confusing. But the Torah summarizes the two main shittas. The two main shittas are like this. Li Rashi, according to, and obviously the reason you have multiple shittas is because there's Gemaras, and the Gemaras seem to go in different directions. So it's a question of how you're going to take these few Gemaras and turn them into one whole, and the Rishonim have different ways of how they do that. Li Rashi, according to Rashi, ein chayavin al chimutza kares. When it says mei peiros ein machmitzin, it means there is no kares for a chametz that comes from fruit juice. Aval chametz nuksha hava. It's still what the Gemara calls, about other things, chametz nuksha. Chametz nuksha means an inferior type of chametz. Either it's inferior because from a food perspective, this is not good food, or from a chametz perspective, that is from a fermentation perspective, it's not a good fermentation. So either one of those could be called chametz nuksha. And a chametz nuksha, by definition, there is no iser of kares. There's a lav, you're not allowed to eat chametz nuksha, but there is no iser kares. Continues Rashi and says, "Va'afilu b'mei peiros lavadon." Rashi shita is that even if you're only working with fruit juice with no water mixed inside, so it's like, again, water is the default agent that like cause leavening. So and here you have mei peiros. Mei peiros doesn't cause leavening. So even if you only have mei peiros and you have no water, still Rashi shita is asar lalush. You're not allowed to use it. Why are you not allowed to use it? This is where it ends up being this really interesting thing. Because fruit juice has this phenomenon on where it actually causes chimutz quicker than water. Not slower than water, quicker than water. And because it's quicker than water, you're not going to catch it. You're not going to be able to do it. So with regular water, you say, work with the dough and make it quick and get it into the oven, and then it's matzah, not chametz. With fruit juice, you don't even have the ability to do that because it's such an expedited process of becoming chametz. So therefore, you're never allowed to use it. But remember, if it does become chametz, what type of chametz does it come? It comes only chametz nuksha. So it's a chumrah and a kula. The chumrah is, it runs to the goalposts of chametz. And it's like running there. But the poil never gets to that goalpost mamish. It only gets to the one that's chametz nuksha, which is forbidden. Now, if you follow this position of Rashi, you're basically going to say a yid will never use fruit juice in a dough on Pesach. You never, even if it only was made pairs without any water. How much more so if it had water mixed inside as well? Then you never would be using it on Pesach. But again, if you did come to use it, it wouldn't be kares. So this is what we'll call the stricter position on mei peiros when it comes to Pesach. However, we also have a more lenient position. The Torah quotes the lenient position, Rav Alphys, that if he goes all the way to the other extreme. What does he say? Afilu b'mei peiros imayim, even if there's water mixed into juice, still it doesn't cause chametz. It doesn't cause chametz. And again, there's a lot of commentary on this. The Rosh explains the meaning of the rif as follows. If it's just fruit juice, it's never going to become chametz. Take wine, mix it into a dough, leave it for months. It will never ferment and never become chametz. It doesn't have the din of chametz on any level. It's not chametz. With water, so then it could become chametz, fine. So it could become chametz. Work with it and spend just like you work with your regular matzah. So basically, according to the rif, can you make doughs that are fruit juice based? The answer is absolutely. If it's pure fruit juice, it's never going to become chametz. If it has water mixed inside, so treat it like a regular dough and deal with it like that. And not only that, the Rif goes further and says, and in fact, you're allowed to even make it and you're allowed to even have it in your home on the first night of Pesach. And what he's saying over here, even though we have this shitta that says, even though the norm is that for matzah on the nights of Pesach, you're only allowed to use lechem oini, which is water-based matzah, and you're not allowed to use a matzah ashira because that doesn't look like impoverished bread if it was made with wine or something like that. So you would think, don't do it and don't have it at home because you're going to mix it up with the mitzvah. You're going to end up using, even though it's kosher l'Pesach, you're going to end up using it for the Seder. The Rif wasn't worried about that either. And so you're allowed to even have it b'leil rishon. So what you see from here is that the Rif was pretty much mekel when it came to mei peiros, which means if a Jew wanted to take 100% pure juice and wanted to make some grain-based thing out of that, it wouldn't be a problem. Even if water was mixed in, okay, get the job done quickly, and it also wouldn't be a problem. As opposed to Rashi, who's like, don't you dare get fruit juice or any of it, don't get any of this mashkin close to your dough over Pesach. So what's for Pesach? So what's happening here? So what is Reb Shlomo saying? Now we understand what Reb Shlomo is saying. Reb Shlomo is basically saying that he follows the Rif, which makes a lot of sense. In Spain, they would follow the shitta of the Rif, and so therefore we could be mekel about mei peiros. So you're saying you're looking to make a dish. You want to make a dish so you can have grain? No problem. Take flour and mix it with milk, wine, honey, or whatever it is, and you're totally fine l'shitas harif, and he doesn't talk about if it's going to be mixed water or not going to mix water. He assumes you're not going to mix water. If it's honey or if it's wine, you're not going to mix water, and so therefore you're going to be fine. And if you are going to mix water, he assumes you're going to do it quickly, and you're also going to be fine. And so therefore, this is a way of having grains on Pesach in a kosher dika way, he says, in a way where, again, beheter, ve'en b'davar beis michosh, and that's why this is step one. That's why this heter is batting leadoff. Now, why is it a heter? It's still a heter because it would seem that there was Rashi's view. Many people took it even in Sfard seriously, and did not use this on Pesach, which is why epes a heter was necessary. That would be my guess. Now he then adds another line, and this line has caused a lot of confusion and halachic anxiety on some level. He goes on to say like this, Uvalayla Rishaynam, and on the first night, right after he finishes saying this matzah ashira, before he goes on to his next heter, he throws in a one-liner. And the first night, Kol sheyechal kazayis matzah, whoever eats a kazayis matzah, kiyam mitzvahs b'erev teichel matzahs, you're doing the mitzvah of b'erev teichel matzahs. So what's the problem? The problem is, the first time I read this, and many others who've read this, because it comes directly in the same paragraph of where he's talking about matzah ashira, it sounds like he's saying over here, and eat a kazayas of your matzah ashira on the night of Pesach, and then not only you're having good dinner, you're also yetz of the mitzvah. The problem is that matzah ashira is usher for the mitzvah, as I said before, lechamoini. And it happens to be that the Rambam holds that fruit juice, orange juice, and pineapple juice is fine. And you could be yetz of the mitzvah. The reason is because for the Rambam's perspective, that's also lechamoini. What type of, you're using orange juice for bread? That sounds very impoverished to the Rambam. However, but the Rambam's very clear. He mentions 4 things that even the lenient position, which is the Rambam negates 4 liquids that you cannot use for your matzah, for matzah's mitzvah. Milk, wine, dvash, and shemen, which are the exact liquids that he was talking about. So all of a sudden for him to say that eat a kazayis of that, and then you're going to be yotze to the mitzvah. Where is that coming from? So this has caused a lot of headaches. But then, when you look again, you realize he doesn't say, earlier he said matzah ashira. Now he says, uvalayda shena kosha yecho kazayis matzah. I think he's talking about regular matzah. In other words, what he's telling them is, you're going to make matzah ashira, and that's going to be what you eat for dinner. And by the way, if you have a way, you speak to your brother who didn't convert, and you have to get one little kazayis of matzah, and he gives it to you in a sandwich bag, and you hide it, and you eat it, so you're yotzim. I think that's what he means over here. I don't think he means the matzah ashira. Also, then why would he say kol shecho kazayis matzah? Why would he say eat only a kazayis? If you're making loads and loads of matzah ashira, so then eat that, then you're good. The fact that he's saying all you need to do is a kazayis indicates to me that he's actually talking about over here regular matzah, and then we solved all the problems. Okay, let's go on to heter number 2. Heter number 2 is chalita, and here it's getting more aggressive. Why is it getting more aggressive? Chalita means scolding, as we'll see in a second. Why is this heter more aggressive? Because we're going to see he's going against the go'inim here. He's not going to be going against the Gemara yet, but he's going to be going against the go'inim, a chumrah of the go'inim over here, which in number 1 he wasn't. In number 1, there was a machlokes of the shoinim, and he's siding with the Rif. Now he's going to be going against a go'inim which was a well-accepted chumrah in his day all over the Jewish world, but nonetheless he feels that in this situation he's going to allow it. So what does he say over here? He talks about chalita. Chalita is the following. He says you want to take flour and you want to cook it on the fire. So he says, if it's sha'ar mashkin, so then ein sham beis michosh. Remember, I hold like the Rif. And if it's apple juice, orange juice, wine, so then I hold like the Rif that you have no problem whatsoever. But even if it's going to be water, I'm close. What do you mean I'm close? He wrote this in a teshuvah, which has the heter. He's just trying to show you that he knows that he's doing something somewhat drastic over here. So he's using the language, what does chalita beroitchen mean? That is, he says, you boil a pot till it's literally boiling. And then you put the soiles inside, while the boil is still being maintained. And then the idea is, just like when you take flour and water, and you put it into an oven, and then it becomes baked, so it becomes matzah, so it's not chametz. So too, you could achieve something similar where the fermentation stops, where the chimut stops in a cooking process. What's a cooking process? Chalita. Chalita is you stick it in while it's boiling in that way. It basically freezes and stops this fermentation process, and this could be done. Where do we see that it could be done? So let's read the passage of the Rosh. The Rosh here is going to quote why we don't do it. But before he tells you why we don't do it, he tells you where you see you could do it. The Mishnah in Maseches Pesachim says that you're not allowed to soak bran that you want to give to your chickens. You're not allowed to soak it in water. Why? Because this bran, after contact with water, is going to become chametz. But that same Mishnah says, avocholtin. You're allowed to do chalita, which is this process of sticking it into hot water. That works. Scalding it works. By the way, there's another area in where scalding works. And that is to remove blood from a shtickle fleish. We all know melicha or tzliya, salting or roasting. But there's another method that the Gemara speaks about, and that is putting it into this boiling pot of water in such a way where, again, the assumption is that it freezes. Just like it freezes the fermentation, it freezes the movement of the blood in situ, in its place. And so therefore, it's going to be kosher because blood in its place is fine. But as we're going to see, we don't do chalita, not for chametz, and not for blood, bisman hazeh. How did that happen? So the Rosh here, in the second chapter of Maseches Pesachim, after he quotes the heter of chalita, he brings a tradition of Reb Shrira Goin. Rav Shrira Goyen was the Goyen in Pimpodisa. He passed away in the early 1000s. And Rav Shrira says, even though it's true that chilut, that when something is chalut, it doesn't become chametz. Lo shamanu b'shtei yeshivos she'etiru zeh. The two yeshivas, this is a very common language that Goinim use, because the two centers of learning in Bavel was Surah and Pumbedisa, and for hundreds of years they were using this language. In the two yeshivas we don't do this, which means Jews don't do this. The only time we do it is l'chaya, that's a woman who's giving birth, or l'chayla, al pi bekiyin, an ill person, and based on the physician's recommendation. Then his son, Rav Hai Goin was a Goin who took over after his father passed away. See, he lived in the 1000s. He says that theoretically, matzah that you put into boiling water has a din of matzah. In other words, it's not chametz. However, says Rav Hai, the Rabbanon Kamoi, the earlier sages, and he doesn't say who. So presumably it was the Goinim in Bavel, after Chasimas Hashas, because we have no record of this takana in the Gemara. They said, Lo yad'inon chalita heichani. It's a very interesting lesson. We don't know what chalita is, or we don't know the right way, the right temperature that requires chalita, or maybe we don't know the right measurements of material versus water. I don't know. But there's something we don't know about this process, which is why we should not do it. He goes on, Rav Hai, to say that there have been a number of people who've been ill, and yet it was very difficult to get them the heter to take to give them barley that was put into water using the method of chalita, and they only allowed it, the Goinim only allowed it for someone who the physician said he's in really bad shape, then they were matir. And something similar happened with chalita for meat and blood, where we say, we don't know how the process works, and so we no longer do it. The Rambam talks about chalita, this process of scalding, and he actually uses a different lashon. It could be he wasn't too thrilled about this idea of we don't know how it works. Doesn't mean you don't know how it works. How do you not know how it works? Like, how did they once know? Why don't we know today? The Rambam in Hilchos Chametz U'Matzah Perek Hey Halacha Gimel says something else. We're afraid Gzeira Shema Lo Yartiach Hamayim Yafa Yafa. We're afraid it's different. We know how to do it. We're afraid that people aren't going to boil the water to the right temperature, and they're not going to get it to where it needs to be. And so that's why we said, you know what, we're banning the entire thing. And the Rambam goes on to say that this minig, to stay away from chalita, is true in Shinar, that's the Middle East, Sfard, that's Spain, Uvechal HaMayrav. Chal HaMayrav either means North Africa, like Morocco. It may even mean like France and Germany, but I'm not entirely sure. So either way, he's saying that large swaths of the Jewish world is not is not using this method. And now you can understand what Rav Shlomo is doing, because Rav Shlomo is going to come now, and he's matir chalita for them. He says, you know what, I'm going to let them do this. Boil up your pot, get it to a boil, stick the flour in, and then it's gonna be all right. We don't do it anymore. He says, but the Goinim allowed for a chayla, remember? So you guys, he established in the beginning of the teshuvah, you have the din mamish of a chayla. So because you have the din of a chayla with a sakana, so therefore we're going to be mekel. But again, it's an aggressive move. This is not just ignoring Rashi to follow the rif. This now is you're ignoring a widespread custom taken on by the Goinim. But nonetheless, he feels this is what we need to do. And he says, don't be machmir here. If you're going to be machmir, it's going to cause, the chumrah is going to bring a kula. This comes up a lot. You're going to be machmir and say, don't do this. What's going to happen? They're going to go eat a whole wheat sandwich, chametz gomer, midaraisa. So therefore, he says, this is his second step, the step of chalita. But then, he goes to the next, more aggressive stage. And what's supposed to happen in this stage is that it's going to go against Gemaras. But Gemaras specifically against things listed in the Gemara as chumras done out of extra caution, rather than things that are forbidden me'ikar hadin. So that's his step number 3. As opposed to step number 4, which we'll soon see, is going not only against the Gemara, but going against the Gemara that's me'ikar hadin, which still he's going to find room to permit. But where he is right now is going against Gemara, where the Gemara gives us chumras, where something theoretically would be permissible, but the Gemara added a layer of chumrah, not the Goinim. Last one was the Goinim added a chumrah. Here it's the Gemara added a chumrah. Okay. The only problem is he's going to do two things in this stage, and he's going to quote a Gemara for both. The problem is the Gemara he's going to quote for the first doesn't exist. So we'll deal with that as we go along. All right, so what's his next method? His next method is as follows. He says, I have this idea, long before Pesach, you're going to make ugos, matzos, that you're going to call kraspilos. Kraspilos is still, Google it, you'll see. It's a cracker that is still associated with Spain. And basically, you're going to make these crackers. Now, he advises them to make it long before Pesach. In other words, because he doesn't want any suspicion. Do this Hanukkah time. No one's thinking about Pesach. No one's going to suspect of any Pesach activity. Do it Hanukkah time. And then he says, you bake these into, it's basically matzah. Why not? You have flour, you have water, it's kosher Pesach, you get it done quickly. And so it never became chametz. And then grind it up and turn it into flour. Today we call this matzah mel. Basically, he's saying, make matzah mel. Then hold it till Pesach, and then when Pesach comes, you could take that matzah mel and turn it into bread, or you could turn it into some sort of dish that's going to be grain, even if you don't want to use chalita. You don't need to use chalita here. Why? Because the Gemara says in Maseches Pesachim, once something is baked, it can no longer become chametz. So if you baked something, and it didn't become chametz before the baking, it will never become chametz. And so you could take this, you take matzah, you have this matzah, you grind it up, you use it as flour, you use it as matzah mel, it is completely fine moving on. Then he goes on to say, so then why don't we do it? So he goes, Davar kazeloi nesar, the only reason why we don't do this is, and he quotes a Gemara in Pesachim, from Daf Mem Amid Beis. The Gemara in Pesachim over there says, I'll just tell you now, it's not talking about this issue, it's talking about a different issue of cooking flour, and it says, you shouldn't, this method of cooking flour on Pesach should not be done, similar to the concept of a Nazir, where we tell the Nazir, don't go into the vineyard. You're allowed to, but we're afraid if you're in the vineyard, you're going to grab a grape. Go around. Lech amrina linazira. Schar, go around. So just like that, so the Gemara says, similarly, we're not going to allow the cooking of flour on Pesach in the unique way that it's discussing over there. So he somehow, magically, applies that to what we call today gebrachs. And that is, you have a baked matzah, and it's completely baked, so min adin, it cannot become chametz. And so you could crush it up, you could turn it into flour, mix it with whatever you want, and turn it into anything. And he says, we don't do it, which is interesting, because now you know that here's a source that in Spain, they were not doing this in the 1400s. It was considered outside of the norm to engage in that. But he tells us, the Gemara says not to do it, because of we're afraid what it's going to lead to, even though, and here's the problem that I alluded to before, the Gemara doesn't say it about this type of thing. There is no chumrah in the Gemara against gebrachs. There is no chumrah in the Gemara against taking matzah, turning it into flour, and using it in whatever way you want. He concludes that section saying, and remember, he's moving up a step. First, he told them matzah shira, right? Yeah, may pays. Then he told them, well, we'll compromise on the go'inim's chumrah about chalita. Now he's moving up to a Gemara where he's basically saying that we're going to make matzah mel, and he's suggesting that this goes against the Gemara. Well, even if it doesn't go against the Gemara, we do learn from here that they weren't doing this at the time. Why? Why would they not have been doing this at the time? So we don't have Rishonim from Spain talking about this chumrah, or at least not that I saw. And most of the writing on this is from the Achronim, where they spoke about how there's a matzah, and maybe there's a patch that didn't get baked well, and now that you mixed it in water, so it didn't go through a fiyah. Anything that went through a fiyah can't become chametz. But maybe an area wasn't baked well, and now that it comes in contact with water, so it's going to start leavening, it's going to turn into chametz. That's otherwise known as the chumrah of gebrachs. The Achronim spoke about this, the Alter Rebbe speaks about this at great length. But it could be he doesn't mean that. It could be his concern was something else. We have the Ravan, Rabbi Eliezer ben Nosson. The problem is he's from Ashkenaz. He's living in the 1100s in Mainz. He talks about a different issue. He was worried that you're going to go to the kitchen and you're going to say, oh, where's my matzah mel? I like to make a kosher Pesach dish. And you're going to lift up the matzah mel, and instead of picking up the matzah mel, you're going to pick up regular flour, and meanwhile you mixed it now into this bowl of water. You think, oh, it's after afiyah, it's after baking, I'm totally good. And meanwhile, it's not after baking, you just picked up the bag of regular flour. It's interesting that you could get confused between the two, but that's what Ravan says, and that's why Ravan says it's a good idea not to eat a certain dish that he refers to over there because of this problem. So that's a different way of thinking about the problem. It isn't a problem of we're afraid an area didn't get baked. It's more of we're afraid you're going to end up using regular flour. either way, he says, this is mutter. I don't have a problem with it. I have a problem with it, but this is my next step of heter that I'm telling these Marranos they could go ahead and they could do this. He then goes and gives a similar method where he says, look at number 18, where he says, take grain and roast it very, very well in a certain type of roasting vessel, and grind it and turn it into bread. And here again, because it was roasted, just like baking stops the process, roasting stops the process, and you're able to go ahead and use it. The Gemara was not too thrilled about a person who lines his pot with roasted flour. It's a Gemara in Pesachim Daf Lamed Tes. Don't take roasted flour and line the pot, because then it's going to come in contact with water and maybe, right? But it was roasted. Says, yeah, because the reason is we're afraid that it wasn't roasted well. Similar to what Ravan said about why we don't want to use matzah meal on Pesach. So he says, but these guys, you're obviously going to be very, very careful. You're going to make sure that you roast it really well, and so therefore this is going to be okay. So this is all one category. Roasting and baking, it's the same concept. He feels like there are Gemaras that say you shouldn't roast or bake something and then use it later, flour or whatever it is. And then he's saying, for them, we're going to be mater it because even though the Gemara said not to, but in the Gemara, it's a chumrah, so this is the next step that we could go ahead and be mater. And that brings us to his final stage of heter. His final stage of heter is number 19. He says, what if all of these eitzes don't work? And they have no way of avoiding putting yeast, because they must have the loaf to become puffy, so that it doesn't look like matzah. In other words, what's he saying over here? He's worried that the non-Jewish authorities who are concerned about these Jews observing Judaism, he's worried that they're going to say anything that looks too flat, oh, that's matzah, that's matzah. So they need to be able to say, look, I'm eating chametz, and they need to bring out something puffy. So if that's what they need to do, so now we have a heter for them. What's this next stage of the heter? So the next stage of the heter, as we're going to see, firstly, we spoke about this last week, when we spoke about machine matzah. It came up. But what is it? He's going to tell you about something that is aser, me'ikar adin, but firstly, it doesn't have isser karis, which is, remember, something we wanted to avoid. And in fact, it's not even going to have the level of isser lav as well, even though it's aser me'ikar hadin. And this is his last level. So what are you going to do? He says what you do is you mix a little yeast into the dough, but do it in a way that a person in the shira of achilas pras, which is defined as eating, the amount of time it takes 3 eggs, that if the person, so let's say it's, I don't know how long it is, but let's say it's 2 minutes. So in that amount of time, the person will not have consumed a kazayas of chametz. So in other words, you're spreading out the sa'or in a larger batch to such a degree that if a person eats kashir achila, the zman of achilas beitz, gimel beitzim, he will not in that time have ended up eating a kazayas of the sa'or of the yeast. In this situation, there's no kares, he says, and there's no lav, it's only aser. Where does he have this from? He have this from the Rambam. Look at the Rambam, Hilchos Chametz U'Matzah, Perek Aleph Halacha Vav. Zok the Rambam Hazoi, Ein chayavin kares ala lachilas asman shel chametz. Kares is only for actual chametz, not a mixture of chametz. Aval, Eruv chametz. What is Eruv chametz? What does a mixture mean? The Rambam gives 2 examples. Kuta chabavli and sheichar amodi. Kuta chabavli is some dairy product mixed in with some crumbs of bread or something like that. And sheichar amodi is water mixed in with hops for beer. So these are called taroivus chametz. Anything else where it's not a piece of bread itself. It's a taroivus chametz. Here it's not kares. It's only loika. It's only malchus, which means it's a lav, ain't by kares. Okay. When is it a lav? That's only if you had a kazayis, as I said before, in the amount of time of eating 3 eggs. In that amount of time, you ended up consuming a kazayis of this chametz mixture. Excuse me, a kazayis of chametz within the mixture. But if in what you ate, you didn't eat a kazayis of chametz, so then there's no lav. Rambam says it, afal pisha asur lelecho, it's asur. Im achal, if you ate it, ain't eloika, there's no malchus. Rather, makanois and makas martis. And as I said last week, this turns into a major machlekes amongst Shoyin and Machroinim. Is this Isser de'oraisa, just without malchus? Which is an interesting concept. Or are we talking about an Isser de'rabbanan? Either way, Reb Shlomo ben Reb Shimon says, it's not chorus, and it's not a lav. It is an Isser. He doesn't get into de'oraisa, de'rabbanan, doesn't matter. He says, they could, in their situation, they could go ahead and do this. So think about it. He's telling a Yid who's saying, I want to connect to Hashem, in my unique circumstance. He's saying, for you to connect to Hashem, assuming you can't do one, and you can't do two, you can't do three, you can't do, for you it actually means to take chametz gomer, pashut yeast, and to mix it into your batch of whatever type of bread you're going to be making, but to do it in these unique ways where there's no karas and there's no lav. This is what you should be doing. Okay. Last week I mentioned Abraham Geiger. And Abraham Geiger, sometime in the 1800s, he got up and he said, because of a food shortage in the 1840s, I think, he was like, oh, we want to be mater, this type of thing. Okay, the Rabbanim in that generation felt that was highly inappropriate. Okay, so the time and place matter. It's not only, by the way, who's saying the heter, it also matters what the context of the heter is. Who is it being said to? All right, let's go to the conclusion of the teshuvah of Rashbash, Reb Shlomo. He says like this. We knew this was coming. There's no way he would not have included the following paragraph in his teshuvah. No one else could learn to other situations or other people. It is only ad hoc. This is an ad hoc heter for these anusim. Because there's no other choice. And if we're not going to permit any of the four paths I gave, they're going to come to the more serious isser. That's why for them it's mutter. But no one else is allowed to learn for this ever. Okay. But then he realizes he forgot one thing. And he adds this like as a postscript in his teshuvah. He says, pulim va'apunim. What he means is legumes. What we call, in modern parlance, kitnius. Kitnius is an option. This is ein bedavar beis michush. There's no issue there whatsoever. I think that's even less than the matzah ashira that he spoke about earlier. This would be even less. He says, it's only yesh ksas mea safartim shemachmir, and you have a few guys in France that are machmir and kitnius, but leis tachashlu, no one really takes that seriously. Chol shekain be'elu, definitely you guys should not. So if you could get away with kitnius, God bless you, go ahead and go do that. And here we know there's a major divide about kitnius at this time and after this time, in terms of whether this is used by Pesach, leading to the general breakdown of Ashkenazim versus Sephardim, though that probably requires some fine-tuning as well. So this is the very interesting teshuvah that Reb Shlomo delivers to us. It's very organized. He starts out with a foundation, a principle, a model, that's the Gemara in Yuma, and he basically follows it to a T, where he goes 1, and then 2, and then 3, and then he goes 4. And you do learn that even in his day, where it's not 3 years after the persecution. As I said before, we're probably dealing here with a teshuvah from the 1440s or the 1450s. And probably alongside statements of his where he's saying, everyone's Machalei Shabbos. Or you call them Anosim, but they're really Mushamadim. And yet there was a group of people. How big was this group? We don't know. How many people? We don't know. Did they even get this message back? We'll never know. Did they observe Pesach based on this directive? We'll never know. But there clearly was some interest somewhere in this regard, and that is a fascinating thing to learn about. And to find, as I said before, and the fact that a Rav wrote a teshuvah for what you would call very much compromised Judaism, not ideal Judaism, very, very much a broken Yiddishkeit. But then let's come back to remember what the Rambam said. That the Rambam says that although in the cases of Igeres Hashmat, you guys really need to leave. But when you stay behind and you do a mitzvah, you're only doing it for Hashem because you can't do it publicly, and it's not only you're risking your life. You can't. So you're not doing it for any other reason than for your loyalty to Hashem. I think in a very similar way you say about this about these Yidden here. You know, there's so much about Pesach. We get together and it's going to be exciting, it's going to be interesting, we're going to have a good time. It could be very geshmak. And none of this over here was, oh, this is going to be geshmak, this is going to be fun, we're going to have a great Pesach. None of them, we're going to have a great Pesach. But this was not about having a great Pesach. This was about how can we connect Hashem even in a very compromised situation. And so to conclude, the Rebbe, we've also mentioned this in the past, the Rebbe received this gift from Zalman Shazar in the 1950s, this Siddur, which actually was a few weeks ago in the Rebbe's library. I had the chance of actually seeing it with a group of very tired Yidden. But anyway, it's very, very small. It's smaller than this. Very small Siddur. It's like huge. It's like 700-800 pages. And Hebrew with a translation in Ladino, or Spanish, for Jews who left Spain and Portugal and went to live in Amsterdam. And they were now new to Judaism. And so they needed a translation of the Siddur. It's called Mea Brachas. So Shazar sent this to the Rebbe as a gift. And the Rebbe responded saying that it's sitting on my desk, and from time to time, a very interesting lashon, from time to time I look at it, and when I see it, it reminds me that really, to a certain level, every one of us are anusim. Why? Because we're also in a situation where there's outside forces. That outside force may be socially, but it also may be a person's nefesh habahamis, which holds us hostage and doesn't allow us to be true to ourselves. And so therefore, and what is the job of education? The job of education is to get the Jew out of Spain and Portugal, get him out, right? So that's what the job of Jewish education is, to allow the nefesh halikis to have free expression, and that a person shouldn't be bogged down by their social circles and by their nefesh habahamis. So fitting that into here, I think another lesson to learn is those moments in life when we need to do a mitzvah or we need to do a hanhaga tova, but it's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be perfect. And sometimes we walk away with the assumption, you know what, I can't do it right, I'm not going to do it at all. Which is understandable. And here I think you're getting a message that combats that and says, no, you can't do it right, but there's something you could do. If there's something that you could do, obviously in consultation with a Rav. So in consultation with someone who's not biased, who has knowledge, but what can we do? What can we do in this compromised situation is, I think, a good, healthy attitude for living. Akashan and Freilich and Pesach.